Today I'm joined by Angela Nagle. Angela is a writer and academic and the author of the book Kill All Normies. Welcome, Angela.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's really good to have you here because you are originally Irish. I mean, this isn't not your only your only descriptor. You're obviously someone who's been thinking about the cultural spaces that we both travel in for a long time. You've been on the both sides of the debate, and also you've been through the academic grinder and the online grinder and every grinder that our culture likes to put people through who try to put their head above the parapet a little bit. But I want to ask you your first question about being part of the kind of British Isles combination, because I used to live in London for about 5 almost 6 years, and used to work in tech there, and it struck me, and with a lot of obviously Irish people, because a lot of Irish people live in London, but there's always a consensus in a way, under the radar, but it was kind of something you would never question, that the those territories, Britain, Ireland, they didn't really belong to the people that were kind of the ancestral people there. They were British or Irish. And I remember I went to this party once, and it was filled with kind of minor functionaries and bureaucrats and people who were working for the government. And at one point, maybe I was like 2 or 3 beers in, and I asked some of them, like, uh, do native people, like the British or Irish, get to have any say in the destiny of their country? And
Mm.
you could hear a pin drop, because that was a question that no one, you weren't allowed to ask. People people like suddenly distance themselves from me. So I don't know. I could ask that question because I'm Romanian and I'm an immigrant, and I'm, well, woe is me because of Brexit and all that. So I, I get a pass, but it was clear that it's just not a concept. I don't know how do you feel about that? Do you think that that's true?
Yeah, that's absolutely true. I mean, in the case of Britain, I guess the elites, have run an empire, and really with the City of London, it is still kind of an empire in a sense. And they're totally cosmopolitan, and they don't. They're probably even less tied to any territory or land now than they were then. Um, and when they were going around the world to the different colonies and so on. And so their attitude is, well, like, this is just the price of being a world dominating geopolitical force, and they just don't really care. And in the case of Ireland, um, so basically what happened in Ireland was very it struggled for nationhood, which meant also independence from the British Empire, and that was a very long and bloody struggle. And there were many, people just think of 1916 because that was the successful one, but there were many rebellions that were just crushed. So there was actually enormous human sacrifice to win independence. And then, like, not just a couple of decades after we got it, they had this great idea: building a national indigenous productive economy is too difficult. We're just going to become a tax haven. And initially it worked. They did this in the 90s. Initially it worked. The GDP went through the roof. A lot of wealth flowed into the country. It was referred to as the Celtic Tiger. But obviously these things have a price. And, by 2008, when there was a huge bank bailout, just like a massive transfer of wealth from public to private to bail out these banks, the Irish economy never really recovered from that. But they had to keep this model that they're stuck with, this kind of like hyper globalized model. And so, um, once you do that, you kind of lose your national sovereignty to a great degree, because the next thing you know, your economic policy is being set by Silicon Valley. Your public debates and social policies and attitudes and culture are being decided by NGOs. With all of these companies, NGOs just flooded into Ireland, and there, I mean, I would love if, I've never seen a calculation of like how much they outnumber people sort of like in terms of just the population, but there's a lot, let's just say, like there's an unusually high amount of them, and they're extremely aggressive in inserting themselves into newspapers, into television, into public debates of every kind, policy making. And so, yeah, I mean, any debate about nationhood just is about the North, you typically in Ireland. But the really meaningful thing is if the counties that still belong to Britain technically, or are in this kind of liminal state, were ever to rejoin the Irish nation, what would be left of the nation to join? Because that is the attitude, exactly like you said, that elites have just become so distant from ordinary people, that they really don't think that people should have a say, or that they think their attitude is, well, if the native Irish or whatever want to have a say in things, well, why should they have a say above somebody living in Greenland, which is so obviously an absurd thing to think, right? Because all you're really saying is, I don't want to take any responsibility as the political class. I don't want to take any responsibility for anything here. And so, actually, if you think that you should have more of a say than somebody in Greenland or wherever, then that's because you're a nativist, and we're going to, create this kind of, make that into some kind of moral problem. Whereas, like, most people who aren't really that tuned into politics sort of thought, well, isn't that the deal? Isn't that how it works? I live in a country. I'm a citizen of the country. We fought for independence. My ancestors have been here for thousands of years. Doesn't that mean anything? And yeah, so they're trying to. I don't think that outside of the left you can really say that openly, right? Like, you can't openly tell people that that's the case, because it's too ridiculous. You kind of have to have a PhD to have such a stupid thought. But instead they just kind of imply it, let the NGOs enforce it, and then they skirt around the issue.
Yeah. How much of this do you think is just essentially like this American imperial, cultural hegemony seeping through these institutions, through media, through these NGOs, multinationals coming in and essentially injecting a flavor of this progressivism that's caught root in America, but that's not really native. Like, you see a lot of Black Lives Matter and things like that movements. I've seen them in Ireland. They're quite, there is something happening, and I think it's a strange and exotic thing to see in Ireland and in the UK as well, because number one, the incidence of police violence is just it's just nothing compared to the US. And even there, obviously there's some questions to be asked about the statistics that are bandied around. But I've seen protests in Romania, so Black Lives Matter protests in Romania, and we can probably count the Black people in this country on one hand. So it's quite interesting. Like, to me, it feels like this mimetic contagion that's very, very US centric, and it's very strange that it does take root in these countries.
Yeah, I mean, in the case of the sort of imperial, or that influence that you're talking about, there have been some bits of investigative journalism, all independent, of course, because none of the mainstream papers will do this, but that show that, like, Bank of America, funds all kinds of wacky woke projects in Ireland, and nobody seems to ever think like this is strange, or we might want to. I mean, I think that in a strange way, like the way the massive growth of the NGOs is related to kind of the way that I would say global capitalism is functioning in general, which is sort of the just instead of the kind of model that we all thought was the norm since the time of Bismarck, which was like, you have a secular welfare state that you have a right to as a citizen, That was supposed to get rid of like noblesse oblige, which had all kinds of moral strings attached, or relief of the poor by the church or whatever. And now this has sort of turned into, you have this global kind of oligarchic class who won't pay taxes. They find ways to make it impossible to make them pay anything, and so then they just put that money into supposedly philanthropy, um, and which of course also just means like a massive cultural project or social engineering project as well. And yeah, so it's a lot of these kind of banks and the usual people like Bill and Melinda Gates and all these kind of foundations and Ford and so on. And they do very aggressively insert themselves into changing the values of the country. I guess the problem is though that, as with all of these things, when a cultural revolution like achieves this really rapid change overnight and everyone's wondering like, how did that happen, a lot of the time they're kind of tipping over something that wasn't very solid to begin with. So it's usually when we believe something but we don't know why anymore, or we a tradition has gone on through kind of simply nobody challenging it, and we've forgotten kind of why it existed. So I do think that things have gotten to a point now where you just have to relearn kind of the hard way why these things did matter at some point, and why previous generations created institutions that they did, and so on. But yeah, sorry, I've slightly gone off on a tangent. Just on the direct question of the influence of those that kind of stuff in Ireland. It's funny because I've seen these articles in the New York Times and different places about how the French are tired of like the American influence on their intellectual journals and stuff like that. But actually what they're talking about is happening everywhere. And in fact, the worst manifestations of it are not in intellectual journals. They're like, regular people suddenly waking up and not recognizing their own culture because it's been beamed in from California. And they suddenly have to abide by these strange values that are just totally alien.
Yeah, and they're also high status values because it's not, it kind of starts from the head, even here. Like, this is kind of what I noticed in Romania. Like, I keep bringing up this example, but I found a friend of mine was talking about abortion rights in Alabama. And, this is just like your
Yeah, yeah.
regular Romanian girl who's, has absolutely no idea what's going on in local politics. I mean, who has, if it's not Trump, then who cares? It's not,
Yeah, yeah.
it's not a battle between good and evil, but it's
That's so strange to imagine, but yeah, absolutely. Everyone does, and I guess it's like on the one hand, uh, with that political stuff, it's kind of like the theater of it is so all consuming that to not know, if you're in a kind of public conversation that takes place anywhere online, to not know that stuff is just like being out of the loop of what everyone else is talking about. But it definitely gets to a point where I saw somebody saying, I think it might have been Aris Roussenos, who writes for Unherd, saying, if you're having a conversation about American politics and you don't live in America, like you've already lost, you've already lost, like something has gone sort of profoundly wrong with, you're not thinking critically, or you're not like you're not you've completely lost touch with reality, in a strange way, like a woman in Romania talking about abortion in Alabama.
yeah. This is actually because I asked some people to tell me what I should ask you, and I think a friend of mine, Indian Bronson, asked a really good question about this. Is how do you see the relationship between online and offline? Because this is essentially, Aris was saying that you're off the rails if you if you live in hyper reality, because this is kind of
Mm.
these religious wars that we're in, or this weird hyper real space that
Mm.
we inhabit. But I see it shaping actual politics here. Like a lot of reality is downstream from hyper reality. So are you living more in reality if you're kind of not taking advantage of the leverage of the online world, or are you living, if you because now actually online is a place where things get decided. That's kind
Yeah.
of the beating pulse of politics, of culture. So I don't know. It's, to me at least, I don't know exactly where the line is, and am I just more real if I just go back to normiehood, or is it more real to
Yeah.
be battling these egregores online?
Yeah, no, it's an interesting question, and it definitely has a lot. Like, I absolutely don't subscribe to the just log off attitude, this and it really frustrates me as well when you point out some really worrying, like crazy trend that you just know is going to be mainstreamed. Starts off online, some really disturbing social trend. And people just say, oh, that's just 5 people on the internet. What are you talking about? It's not important. And like this was an endless source of frustration for me on the political left for many years. I would keep telling people, really, it's for about 10 years. I would keep telling people, this is going to be a real problem. Like, if you can't have an organization without these, like crazy women trying to call everyone a rapist, or you can't have an organization without everybody walking on eggshells all the time. Like, no normal person is going to ever want to join your organization. Simple things like that. And they all said, no, 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 that's just a few people on the internet. You're totally out of touch with reality, And now it's at a point where you can look at the craziest trend on the internet, and you can write an article saying, this is going to happen, this is going to be law, and let all the log offs say, oh, look at you, you've gone crazy, you're too online, the internet has bent your mind. And you can just sit back smugly and just wait for it to become law, because it will. Because actually these trends really do become reality. And also, as a general rule of thumb, you can never, like, the craziest thing that you can think of will probably be less than what will actually happen, like, so that you never have to worry with with the cultural left about sounding like a crazy person, because you will always be vindicated. But then there's also another way in which it does make you removed from reality. Like, for example, the kind of, I guess, class, or if you like, factional interests that drive politics are often quite local, and are often quite uninteresting and unglamorous, and not just simply not like emotional sugar for the kind of internet mind. So they get ignored. So, for example, if you look at the Joe Biden win in America, one of the reasons why it's so funny, because for 4 years there was this endless conversation about, oh, we didn't see Donald Trump coming, and we got everything wrong, and so on. But then they did it again, but this time by missing the kind of most bland, I guess, option, the most establishment bland option. But if you actually look into what made him successful, I mean, for example, he was one of the only candidates who completely ignored the entire activist class. Basically, he wouldn't even respond an email to many of the kind of open borders, and very kind of millennial identity politics type of activist groups. And afterwards, they were complaining about it, and they actually even thought, like, he doesn't have a chance because he's so bad at politics, because because he's not answering us. And it's actually because I guess most people don't care about that stuff and were tuned out of it. But what he did do is he got like a winning coalition, and he got the Good Old Boys podcast. This is very incestuous
Yeah.
podcast, so, but
Of course.
they talk about this a lot, and I think they've really convinced me of it. But they talk about, like, selectorate theory, and the way in which he basically just got this winning coalition of people together, who had uh, delivered something concrete to a particular group of people, and so they were trusted to do so. So, in other words, they were people who, if you belonged to a faction that were served by this person, you understood that, like, if this person or their guy gets into power, I am going to get stuff. My
Yeah.
life is going to get better, you know.
This
So,
is
I,
politics. This is how it typically works, except
yeah,
for,
absolutely.
yeah.
In Ireland, for example, like politics is very local, and in fact, I hated that when I was younger, but I really appreciate it now because it is a check on these forms of madness that we're talking about, and it does mean that the local politician is a servant, you know, a public servant, and they do have to make sure that the water is running and stuff like that,
They have
you
skin
know.
in the game, back in the day they had, tar and feathers and all sorts of things set to the
Yeah,
side just in case he didn't perform. So yeah, you need to have a little bit of skin in the game as a politician.
yeah, and you know, I also used to not like how in Ireland, it was very local, but also the two main parties historically are fairly ideologically similar, and they split over the treaty, which came in the War of Independence period, um, and basically it was about the North, and it was about the conditions of breaking away from the British Empire. But so there isn't actually a concrete difference between the two parties. One slightly emerged along class lines over time, but I don't think that was exactly intended. It was just one of these things, like, um, that happened sort of in terms of who supported them: more farmers on one side, more working class on the other, that kind of thing. Um, but um, but I really appreciate that now, that we don't really have, because it means that to some degree, the lack of maybe a purely ideological competition in politics, or very intense, like, right left ideological competition, means that Irish people can actually work together and not be at each other's throats all the time. And it also kind of means that you're not living in a fantasy where political philosophy governs the universe, you know. This is something that I used to really believe, and I realize now, after way too many years of not realizing and wasting my mental energy, that actually political philosophy is truly the most pointless thing to engage in imaginable, because it really doesn't decide anything. You know, I mean, you know, you can stick any ideological label on a regime, and it will look remarkably similar to one that develops around the same time under the same material conditions that calls itself the opposite thing. So, you know, most of what we call socialism, even like, say, actual socialist states in the world today, they would be considered fascism by the millennial left and its values, right? Because, just for example, most of them, not, you know, are very strict about border control, right? For example, that and like, to the Americanized left, that's like the only thing actually for them. I think almost it's almost the only issue that they are really live or die about, you know. And so, you know, is Fidel Castro left wing, or was Fidel Castro left wing? I mean, not by American standards, no. Was Stalin? Like, no. You know, like, if you think of the Khmer Rouge, like a kind of, you know, or North Korea or something like that. I mean, it's not like I know that the DSA don't see themselves as being part of like a tradition that includes North Korea, but, you know, at the same time, like, I do think that there is this tendency, maybe when you're younger, to think that if you solve the puzzle of political ideology and political philosophy, then you will eventually reach the kind of, you will come up with some brilliant kind of way of solving these problems. But whereas in actual fact, there are pressures that are actually shaping things that are vast, and that you probably won't even be able to see until, you know, 50 or 100 years into the future. Big, you know, environmental, technological, all kinds of changes happening, unintended consequences from things we did 100 years ago, and so on. And that actually, you know, the ideology is really just it's like an anthem or something, right? It's just the dressing that goes on afterwards in many cases.
Yes, absolutely. How much of this is a function of scale? Because I keep thinking, okay, you know, a lot of the dysfunction and the places where things get really ideological are, you know, what is the best global regime? You know, trying to answer questions
Yeah,
like
yeah,
that.
yeah, yeah.
And you know, when you think at the level of like you said, you know, Ireland has local politics and things get solved in local politics because there's leverage. You know,
Mm.
people, few rulers. You know, you are accountable because we know where you live.
Yeah,
But if it's, you know, people in Davos, then, you know, I really do not want anyone in Davos to decide major questions of my life because I have no link to them. They don't know me.
yeah.
They don't know the specific, you know, either material or spiritual conditions of my life. So that, I feel like that's a big difference. And I feel like, you know, the multinational NGOs, the, you know, the cultural hegemony that we all live under kind of has spread this idea that, okay, we need to solve the world, but there are very few global problems that can't be solved through cooperation between sovereign nations or sovereign groups, and very, very many local problems that cannot be solved at all by global government.
Yes, and a great many things that can be made worse by the that form. Yeah, it's funny too because there's also been this total redefinition on the political left of internationalism, you know, because internationalism, which presupposes nations, right, is like a cooperation between sovereign nations. And but now it has um you know it has it's like the again, this is the ideological like trick that I was talking about. We think that we have this really radical political spectrum, but I mean, like the radical political left in the West, like its views on well, first of all, it holds what it calls internationalism to be absolutely sacred, right? This is not something you can continue to be on the left and disagree with. But its definition of internationalism is exactly the same as the World Economic Forum or whoever. You know, it's not cooperation between sovereign nations because sovereign nations are bad. Because having a sovereign nation is nationalism. I mean, technically, you know, they're actually taking a very, very technical truth and just making it absurd. But yeah, their views, in other words, which they can use to purge to purge kind of elites or influential groups of people from anyone who disagrees, happen to you know perfectly align with the needs and also the vision of that kind of international elite, you know, like or international capitalist class, if you like, the capitalist class who are dominant on an international scale. Um, and so, I mean, is there any real ideological disagreement there? Like they have exactly the same vision. There shouldn't be really any sovereign nations, and um, and that's a good thing because, you know, so if you have sovereign nations, you'll just have World War III. That's like a very common,
Yeah.
you know, you'll always have war. But again, like you know, the not only are things often made worse by that kind of so-called international cooperation, but you know, things that can be solved on a local level, as you say, like in my local town in Ireland where I grew up, you know, you can literally walk into the guy's office. Like if he hasn't done something, if you want him to fix your well or something, you can just knock on the door. Anyone can just knock on the door, you know. And so having that kind of power is important. Another thing that they often say on that podcast I mentioned is like how whenever somebody's like portrayed as a corrupt local kind of guy who says like, you know, um like I'll scratch your back and you scratch mine kind of thing, like that style of politics, that's always seen as being seedy and corrupt, like you're in the mafia or something. But it actually just means that all it means is that you're actually doing things like that's how it's meant to work. You give people things and they give you their loyalty, that they will vote for you. or they will support your campaign or whatever it is. Um, I do think that a certain degree of corruption is good on that level, or
Yeah.
so-called corruption. It's not.
Yeah, it's essentially being accountable to each other, at a intimate level between
Yeah.
people and people who solve their problems, because that should be the purpose of good government, to solve local problems, or whatever scale you want to introduce there. To me, it feels like a lot of this stems from the fact that market liberalism cannot interact with collectives; it only interacts with
Mm,
individuals, and it has created a world of individuals, because that's why we can't really talk about nations, because nations, it's already a coercive concept to clump individuals together into these groups, either by god forbid civic nationalism or something terrible like that. But the idea that anyone is more than a universe of one is already kind of a scary thing, and it's already kind of conjures ideas of coercion. But the thing is, people exist in these networks. They exist in families and communities, ideally, because this is already breaking down quite significantly. They
mm.
exist in groups of friends and people who are like-minded about all sorts of things. So I don't know, what do you think about kind of this philosophical underpinning? Because it feels to me like the market really, because it's so good at fulfilling individual desire, it really does rip out the substructure from any sort of other association that people might have.
Yeah, I mean, I guess like America is maybe the test case, because I remember a time when it would be remarkable. Maybe it probably wouldn't anymore, but like Americans say, "Where are you based?" instead of "Where do you live?" I don't have the figures to hand, but I know that like they live in many different places throughout their lives. Each place for maybe 5 to 10 years. Like, so you're actually never really putting down roots anywhere. Um, and stuff like that. And that's become the norm now for uh, many countries as well. And so if you have to move everywhere for work, even something like uh, friendship, right? Like, people used to remain friends with their childhood friends throughout their whole lives. You can even see it in novels and things like that. It was like a common thing, a very, very deep friendship with a childhood friend. Well, like, now people will actually abandon friendship for career, and for moving for those reasons. And I don't mean, it's not their fault. It's just that's the nature of the way the economy works. You have to follow a certain path, and each step might bring you to a completely different place. So you just have to keep moving. Um, and so, but I don't know if I would say it's kind of like those conditions that are imposed, that that it kind of has to have a culture and a set of values that adapts to that. Otherwise, people would reject it. And so, if you think of the 90s is actually a good place to look for kind of propaganda, and when a lot of this stuff was becoming normalized. Because in the 90s, and in fact, when I was looking up stuff about Ireland, and now Ireland did change it moved to that low corporation tax, ultra globalized economic policy in the 90s. But the 90s was that, like, there was a moment in the 90s where, you know, like, Wired magazine was like claiming that that Silicon Valley had basically solved the problem of economic downturns, and that there would never be an economic crisis again,
Oh, the
and
hubris.
and that there would just be endless growth. I mean, they said this, it was actually on one of the famous covers, that there would be just endless growth, no economic crises. Everyone would get to work in the knowledge economy, which would be good for the environment, because you wouldn't be extracting things from the ground and stuff like that. And yeah, that was the entire vision. And that is the vision that's kind of starting to, we're only starting to see the contradictions of it now. Um, and that vision itself, that post-industrial vision, goes back even further. I often recommend to people this really interesting book called Imaginary Futures, which is by Richard Barbrook, and he talks about the different well, kind of like this particular vision of the future that keeps emerging, and it's more or less the post-industrial society. But he specifically talks about how the American government brought in these kind of Cold War Trotskyists, right, who are very um, who had this like knowledge of Marxism and understood, I guess, the nature of like what held appeal in it. Um, and so they kind of created this like vision of historical materialism for America, where the next stage would be the post-industrial society. That would be kind of like the final stage, like an international post-industrial society where automation and various things had made hard labor a thing of the past. And basically, it's sort of like the bug man, right? Like that idea of the urban bug man. Like the urban bug man is the ideal kind of the ideal person, like the ideal citizen of such a kind of system. Um, and so yeah, I think that like you cannot have the economy, you can't have that kind of economy where everything is intensely managed by HR, where you have to move every few years, and where you have to be able to move money around the world instantaneously. And there is this globalization of the economy. I think to go with that, you kind of have to have a culture that makes sense with it. And during that period where those changes were really happening, if you look back, like a lot of the propaganda, I guess, at the time was very much about like digital nomads and things like that, and or like if you think of like the advertising for like a phone company or something like that, it was all about just like roaming the world with nothing but a phone and and just like a little tiny bag kind of thing. That was like the vision. So yeah, I think it's only now that that's actually starting to, and people definitely bought it. Like I did myself to a large degree, and I definitely, like, it's funny to now be talking about national sovereignty and things like that, because I definitely never had any nationalist like feelings whatsoever when I was younger. In fact, I really disliked it. Um, and I saw it very much as the typical bugman does now, as like just a kind of like a strange superstition of some kind, and I thought, and I didn't like it because I thought that's so, I'm talking about when I was much younger, right? But I thought like that's so um that's so narrow-minded, and just why would you have more interest in your own boring place than in some fascinating culture elsewhere in the world? That's genuinely the way I thought. And I also thought, uh you know like traveling was like very important to me, and being able to be flexible and stuff like that. Yeah, I mean, and even earlier than that, my own parents like emigrated when they were maybe, what would they've been, I guess, in their early 20s or something. And my parents left like a job for life, that really, anyone now, any young person now would kill for. And they didn't even go finish school, let alone go to college. And yet they dumped it all for just like traveling and stuff like that. And I've asked them many times, why did you do this? Because if you hadn't done that, we would have a house in the middle of Dublin, which would probably be worth millions now. And they can't give me a good answer other than adventure. They just wanted adventure, so I mean, that's I think that when you talk about kind of these things, I guess because it's so heated, right? And because each political team sort of they want what people say to reflect well on the political outcome that they want. But if you really talk to people about sort of why they why they do things like leave an amazing job like I described, to just go around the world and end up with less than you started, or even like, why would you live in a tiny little like a pod in San Francisco or something like that? You generally just find that like the person generally doesn't really know. Like they're not really able to give a good answer, but they have a sense that this might lead to something interesting or fulfilling at some point. Like there really isn't a bigger plan a lot of the time.
Yeah, I think that's quite, on the money. I remember when I when I was kind of younger, we were just, everything that was emanating from the US or kind of Western media was kind of selling this, self-making self idea of the individual that kind of crafts this romantic narrative of their life and then
Mm.
fills it with adventure and takes the reins. And if there ever was a family depicted, maybe there was this show called Seventh Heaven, which was like this Christian show, and they had a nice family, but that was the last show, and that was like the early 90s that I saw a good depiction of family and community life. The rest was
Mm.
all like, horrible disasters, sleeping with the enemy, men, kicking your teeth out, and, all sorts of ideas about terrible divorces and never getting married. And obviously, Sex and the City was the beacon of female empowerment. So,
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and isn't it interesting though? I was thinking that since the post-war period, American popular culture has been so central to its soft power. Um, but now, I think I don't think anyone would really try to claim that the movies are as good as they once were, or the music, or anything else. Right? There's really nothing being produced. But then, so I thought, well, maybe that's a sign, that this is running out of gas, and people are falling out of love with this whole idea, which was always about individualism. And this is kind of a theme I've written about for years, which is like the counterculture is always the most individualistic, and it's actually always the kind of spear tip. It's the like the mainstream like pop culture or whatever will follow, like where the counterculture goes first. But um but but then I thought maybe this is just like one expression of American decline, maybe, as the dominant global power, kind of like without competition in the world. But then I thought, no, because actually what's really happened is that hyper politicization and via the internet is the thing that has replaced that, right? So it's not like rock and roll anymore. It's people in Belfast doing a Black Lives Matter protest where there's only white people, and where they had an ethnic conflict, like a brutal ethnic conflict between two groups of white people for decades, just like totally crazy stuff. But that's what it is. And actually, you could even argue it's more aggressive and successful, because because while there were McDonald's everywhere in the world and so on, but I think it was actually a less successful form of American soft power than this thing, which is completely transformed the national political conversation of every country that it's touched. That's what I said when I see those articles about France. I mean, I guess like a certain type of American intellectual loves the idea of French, of everything French, and imagines like in Paris, like everyone there must be smart, and that they have like a special level of sophistication or whatever. But actually, like there's nothing unique about it. The everything that's happening in their universities is happening in Irish universities. It's happening in probably Romanian ones. And yeah, and probably probably well outside of Europe as well. Um, so that's kind of a horrifying thought. I got a little bit excited about the idea that, you know, like this kind of American global cultural hegemony would break down, and maybe countries would like rediscover these kind of unique things about them. But no, I actually think that this is it instead. It's not, instead of like James Dean or something like that, it's just going to be crazy political stuff.
Yeah, I feel like there might be something to be said about this being waves. So, the first wave was, the watching Dallas, then, watching Buffy the Vampire Slayer, kind of getting into the mindset of this type of individualism, American individualism, kind of market social liberalism. And then, once you've been primed, once you have that mindset, you're essentially set up as a group conflict with people who don't have that mindset. Because essentially, to me, this is what it feels like, that these two factions are on the internet as well as offline. There's people who have bought into this flavor of individualism and are seeing it to its logical conclusion, which is kind of the
Mm.
woke demographic. And there are people who are either, the somewhere people that are kind of tied to their community, that see value in all of this stuff, that, maybe are a bit retrograde, maybe just you don't want to don't want to go ahead, or maybe they see the folly of, like me, they've seen, where this leads, and maybe they want to retrace their steps a little bit. And it feels like this is that's kind of the spiritual conflict. It wouldn't have worked without setting the stage first with all of this cultural import. I
Mm.
wouldn't know what it is to embody the spirit of Sex in the City if I wasn't just like marinating in it for 10 years.
Yeah, yeah.
So I don't think you would have had the religious conflict without, having the 20 years of MTV before.
Yeah, that's true. And you know, it's interesting when you said about kind of retracing your steps. Like I sometimes I think that, you know, the point at which this will get interesting is when there are more people who are like us. I mean, based on what you're describing, I think we're sort of similar in that sense. So in other words, like if we use the somewheres and anywheres just as a way to easily categorize this, you know, if you are a somewhere, uh, I mean, there's a lot of factors that go into making that the case, but I do think that, I do think there's something to kind of that, like, I think it was Jonathan Haidt's argument that there are these sort of temperaments, like political temperaments, you know, and some people are, um, let's say, like familiarity, and other people like constant change, that kind of thing. I think that, you know, there are some people who just want to live in their hometown, you know, and they want to stay there, and they like things that are familiar, and they want to be close to their family, and they want to do all that stuff. I think that when it kind of starts to get interesting is when you see a faction of the people who um should have been in the kind of in a kind of more global cosmopolitan class actually rejecting it, you know, who maybe by nature are well suited to it, but who have actually realized the problems that come from it. Because in a way that is the faction of the elite peeling away that all kind of, you know, people looking to change a society are looking out for, right, as the marker of when things really start to move into gear. Like in the sense that I think there are going to be a lot more people like us who are sort of like would-be elites, if you like, um, people who are trained to be in an elite. Um, so in my case, for example, you know, I went through academia, and if you had asked me in my early 20s, I would have thought, I'm going to be an academic. I'll devote myself to a life of ideas and I'll travel the world. That would have been like a completely idealistic vision of what it was going to be. But then you realize, okay, sorry, we wrecked all the cities, so that's not going to happen. You can't, unless you live in a gated community or something, like you're actually going to be living in a violent and scary place. And also, we wreck the institutions. Academia, you can't have, if you're interested in ideas, academia is the last place you should go, because you have no freedom of thought whatsoever. You're teaching students who could snitch on you at any moment. You've got 100 elite aspirants like clawing at your heels, trying to take you down so they can take your job or whatever. Like, it's not, so in other words, like the vision that was sold, the sort of, yeah, that cosmopolitan kind of like elite vision that I bought into when I was younger has actually fallen apart. It's not workable anymore. I mean, every day I see more and more like news from New York that there's just like the violence is like skyrocketing. So you have all these bug people who went to go and live there so that they could socialize with other people, I guess, in the media world or in the arts or whatever it might be. And then you realize that actually, I mean, I went there, and again, like if you come from a smaller place, you kind of think this is going to be a place where there'll be lots of interesting people and lots of like-minded people and stuff like that. And then, like I often say, I think I might have been saying it to Amy, that Amy Teresa does the What's Left podcast, that like my own friends at home in my home, like in Dublin, are much more interesting and much more kind of intellectually developed than the average like Brooklyn like elite. So anyway, what I'm saying is basically just that like that vision is falling apart. It's not, if you believed in what it was supposed to offer, which was very attractive as an ideal, like that itself has fallen apart. It can't deliver on those things anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like, the millennial generation was the one that was sold this bill of goods probably at maximum intensity. It kind of hit a peak with my generation. At least, obviously, maybe this is just my point of view being in the middle of it, but we're kind of nearing a point where a lot of promises have been unfulfilled, and this is not just about student loans, not about just not being able to make money, get on the property ladder, all this host of problems that are quite endemic in this generation. But it's also just not being able to procreate, which is kind of the scariest part of me. And I've been looking at this from multiple angles, and the demographic collapse seems to me pretty much as good an existential risk as we see for the peoples of Europe. I'm parochial here, but I really do care about this continent and its people. So I don't know what's your take. I feel like you would maybe agree with me that there's something in the way we've structured the market, that the global market has some forces that are kind of underneath this, and kind of stripping apart multiple layers of things that would help people typically be able to have children, but now they can't, or they won't, maybe.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, everyone's now reading that stuff about plastics and the declining sperm count and stuff like that. And I think that's good. I mean, all that stuff, I'm sure there are many other things of that nature too that are, that you could, that could be regulated and changed, that are, that are actually environmental or physical like that. But I also think that like this is very vague and sort of impossible to prove, but I think that there is almost something like a spiritual element to it as well. Like if you think about, for example, like Native American like birth rates plummeted, right? They're very low. Now you could say, well, they don't, they don't live in a way that's similar to a a highly strung career woman in London or something, right? And yet that is similar. And I think it has to do with a group of people feeling that they don't have a future, or in another way that basically things have stopped making sense. So like Mary Harrington talks about this. I heard her talking about it last night, and she's really interesting on it, which is that, there used to be stages of life. and pretty much every culture like has some conception of this, that there are different stages of life, and that you get, as you, so for example, we used to understand that you get more maybe respect as you get older. Your opinion counts for a little more. People listen to you. They feel that you have wisdom, and you get that kind of respect. Um, but you don't have youth anymore, right? When you have youth, when you have all the benefits of youth, you don't have freedom. And there was wisdom in that, because adults understood that you have to kind of save young people from themselves in some way, and to protect them and so on. And yeah, there was this kind of sense that you just pass, in the case of women certainly, like these kind of three stages. So like youth, motherhood, and old age. So even like in my case, like I remember, my older female relatives like all had that, and they were very, they were very much like treated very respectfully and very well as they got older, and everyone visited them, and everyone loved them, and like they were given this like special place kind of in the whole ecosystem of the family and the neighborhood and the whatever. And so the thing is, like, because we've basically just slashed a big line across that, all of those kind of parts of the social world that work together and that made sense with each other now no longer do. So, for example, I read your piece about this. The whole question of people not having children, and one of the things I think you mentioned it at the end that really occurred to me is like, the sort of carrot and stick with everything, right? People make their decisions on the basis of negative and positive reasons. And I think in the case of children, it's almost like there is an absence of positive reasons. Like, obviously there's, people say, well, isn't having children like a good enough reason in and of itself? But we know that people really only bond with children and get filled with all of those feelings once the baby is born. Women experience some of it a bit earlier, obviously, but you know what I mean? So you don't feel the love of a child that doesn't exist yet beforehand. So it's sort of meant to happen by accident, right? And then you love them when they're born. You're not meant to be planning it out like the whole time. But so I think that, there is an absence of a positive reason. So in other words, if you say to like a 20-year-old female, if somebody says to her, like, you should be having children or something, right? Well, and she has to weigh up her two options. It's not just in her imagination that going without them will bring a lot of benefits to her life. And even like, because this very high competition world, like of professional class stuff, is all men and women mixed in together, I think there's something that people don't really talk about very often, which is that if you if you are a single female, the very fact that you are a single female doesn't mean that you're necessarily going around flirting with everyone. But the very fact that you're a single female will open doors to you that will probably be closed to you if you have to, if you're like a mother of three or something. And so yeah, I do think that people don't have a positive vision of the future, which is what like really having children is all about, and in the grand sense. But they also don't have a positive vision of the immediate future, in that I think they think, well, if I have a child, all of these doors are going to close to me. All of my friends who are out having fun and self-actualizing or whatever are going to be doing those things, while I'm going to be completely socially isolated, because the whole culture is built to socially isolate me now, right? And so all of these doors will close. A lot of things will get worse. And I think I mentioned it to you before, but a friend of mine said one time, a friend of mine who was kind of the first in our whole friend group back home to have kids, she said to me years later that when she had her first kid, she was totally socially isolated and we just left her out of everything. And I felt terrible because it never even occurred to me. I just assumed she must be so busy she can't come to anything. But no, it's because like you're doing things that children can't be at. So you've got like a drop in opportunities, a drop in social status, less opportunities to socialize. Um, and also on top of that, because we have this horrible culture, and this is another part of the post-war American kind of disease, which is that we have a culture that is in which children are kind of encouraged to be hostile to their parents, and so you don't even, if you have a child now, like you don't have any expectation that you will be, that you put in all this effort into this thing, into building this kind of new like social unit like of the family, and that when you are old you will, they'll be able to take care of you. Basically you take care of them and then they take care of you. None of all of that's gone. And so basically just like the entire the entire complicated social web that made the whole thing make sense has been destroyed. And so I think that is so complicated that it's not even something that we can really register in a rational way, or even fully comprehend. We just know intuitively that something is not there.
Yeah, for sure. And I feel like a lot of this kind of boils down to that moment where, because of all of this innovation, because of all of this, the kind of techno capital trying to fulfill every need and desire, we really didn't need each other anymore. Like, back in the day in the ancestral village, you couldn't really, go out and have, have a I don't know, Rumspringa trip and do whatever you wanted, and then maybe come back or maybe don't come back, because you were extremely dependent on your family, both for social purposes, for sustenance, for shelter, for everything, to represent you politically in all sorts of ways. And there were obviously massive downsides to this, because there's just all sorts of primitive customs tied to it, some good, some bad, but we needed each other. And now we don't need each other, and it's quite obviously we don't need each other, because parents, and the relationship between children and parents is seen as some form of kind of coercive, oppressive organization, where you kind of raise the child, but you also don't want to curtail its freedom, because you're essentially incubating an individual, which is a pretty hard thing to do, considering how free they're supposed to be.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's to me, tying back those knots if you don't need them is, I think, the tough part of this. Like, will people want to do it? Because, like, for example, I've had all sorts of fights with my mom growing up, and I went to see like a therapist, obviously oversharing here and stuff, but usually the main gist of it was like, you don't need this relationship. The therapist told me, this is an optional relationship.
Wow.
If this is not serving you, it's not sparking joy, you
Yeah. Yeah.
should detach. So I'm like, okay, well, cool. Awesome. I don't know. I'll think about it, man. So
Yeah, no, I'm sure if you go back and look at like advice columns and things like that, like, or just like wherever else, I can't think of them about, like, advice would be like in like women's magazines and stuff like that. Yeah, I do remember seeing all kinds of things that were bizarre, actually, and that really were just like, yeah, your old dad is cramping your style. Just get rid of him.
yeah, it's I don't know. It seems to be a pattern, and I mean, like you said, there's very little upside to the potential parent, except for maybe some, I don't know, spiritual commitment to the act of
Mm.
having children itself. But even that's hard to conjure if you don't really know what it involves. Because, like, even myself, I haven't really spent that much time with children or in groups. We were quite a modern family in the Western sense, and we didn't really have like a lot of social ties or a lot of extended family. I'm the single child of single children, which is quite rare here in Romania, but it happens. So it's
Yeah.
a very very small family, and you just don't understand what a large family is like, or what caring for other kids is like, and you kind of you can't be attracted to something that you've never even experienced.
Mm. Yeah, that's true. I have no excuse though, because I grew up around a huge family, a very, very large rural extended family. But, I mean, look at the scale, right? It went from 12 to 2 to 0 in, in 3 generations. Um, and, but I do think, yeah, that's what it is. I also think that, the explanations for it are very interesting, and I'm sure there will be many more to come now that I think it is part of the mainstream political discussion, that people are like, even with that New York Times article about the BPA and all that stuff. Um, I think that people will be trying to put forward theories as to why people are not having children. There'll be, some of them will be like chemical, some will be sociological, and so on. But in terms of very practical things, one of the things I suggested, and we talked about this briefly before, is that you can actually have a lot more social events that are more family friendly. That's something that anyone can do, really. Like, and it's very, you don't need to change the world kind of in order to get there. You can do it immediately. And it means that um, it means that, just like families are reintegrated into public life in a way.
Yeah, I think that's probably the closest step that people can take. And
Yeah.
yeah, because to be honest, looking at the immensity of coordination problems that global politics throws up, I mean, the only solution
Yeah.
I have is like maybe start a garden in your backyard, have a few kids, be nice to your neighbors. This is this is ground zero. If we all do it,
Yeah. Yes,
it's
exactly. And
gonna
I
work.
also think that, see, I would have been horrified by this idea in the past, because I would have thought, well, that's just giving up. You're just giving up on the political fight or whatever. But what I think is that I think that all of us have lost our sort of political innocence. Well, anyone who's really paying attention has kind of lost their political naivety over the last few years, because I think that we are all just like behaving like, like a teenagers or something, where we just thought, I will come up with the most perfect political philosophy, and then when everyone sees how good it is, the world will change. And like, it's such a crazy childish way of seeing the world, but also, yeah, like, I think the thing that lots of people have realized is that, yeah, politics is really hard, because it involves getting to influence the whole fate of the nation or world. Like, you can't just stroll in and like suddenly start influencing politics. Like, it's cutthroat sometimes, literally, because it's everyone vying for power. And they've made it so that you can't. They've made it so that, precisely so that, and in a way that's a good thing, right? Because that means that any lunatic can't just go in and start changing things. They've made it extremely difficult to change, and they've thought of every way of thwarting whatever it is you want to do. And yeah, I think that kind of loss of like of political innocence is something that may be a generation defining thing, actually, right? Like, people may retreat a little bit to some extent, like, um into that sort of localism.
It's also exhausting, just mentally exhausting. If you want to throw yourself in the midst of it, it's it's
Yeah.
it's a constant battery on your mind, because and nothing really gets done because you're essentially, you're logically moving through all the philosophies, for all the political philosophies, and then what you're actually confronted with in the political arena is the bare naked face of power, and that is it.
Mm,
There's, you can throw your books away, lady, because we have no place for
yes.
them here. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right. That's very much the realization I've come to more recently. And also, yeah, it does weigh on you too much. Like, you know, uh I was saying to friends of mine that I that I had been horrified when my mother said to me, um, I hope you're not saying anything. My mother said to me, I hope you're not saying anything controversial. Right, that's like her advice. Just don't say anything controversial. And I was like, well, I write about politics, so what am I supposed to write about? And anyway, a friend of mine said to me, actually, she's totally right, because, in truth, like, to what extent are you, like, you feel like because you're getting all this resistance that you must be saying something profound, or you must have hit on some really important, like, sore spot, or this is all very important. But yeah, I'm not sure really how important it is, and also I'm not sure how much, like, just the raw exercise of power really, as you say, cares about any of these things. Like, they'll just put any label on it they want. It was even interesting to see, just as an example of the of how these things are exercised. So in the U.S. elections, when somebody came up with, oh yeah, the Tara Flynn or something like that, this woman who had a sexual allegation against Joe Biden.
Tara Reid, I think, was.
Tara Reid, that's right.
Mhm.
Yeah, yeah, Tara Reid. And so the Bernie people thought, like, oh, we've struck gold. We have this is going to ruin him now, because we know, of course, after years and years of Me Too's, we know that if you get Me Too, that's it, you're over. But then they tried it and it just didn't work. I mean, aside from the fact that it's frankly sounded bogus, and I'm sure they knew that, but they were just doing it anyway out of they thought political cleverness.
Yeah.
But it's like, no, you can't Me Too someone who we want to have in power. That's not how this works. You can Me Too some totally insignificant journalist, who maybe said something that powerful people don't like, or something like that, and who isn't that important anyway. But no, they can just turn off the tap, like, if they, at any point, if they want to, because it is just power. It's factions, and it's resource competition, and it's social classes. But I would say, kind of, they're a lot more subdivided than I would have thought in the past. And basically, yeah, it's a class competition. It's a factional competition for wealth, resources, and power. And there's nothing. Everything else is sort of just like, anything else that you engage in, you are in danger of self-delusion.
Yeah, and the self-destruction sometimes.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it does feel to me, but maybe this is also my echo chamber, that there are power centers kind of coagulating in different places, like, because the narrative is so fractured. Power seems to be fractured. Obviously, maybe it's just the external, I don't know, phenomena of power. Maybe power is quite centralized, but the phenomena that you see is that, okay, there are certain factions forming. I don't know if, because I know you're not very online anymore, or maybe you are, but you're not in a very visible way. You're not online anymore. Do you see anything kind of on the horizon in the online space, or some changes that are coming up? I think you've dropped off a little bit.
Oh, sorry. Changes of what kind exactly?
In terms of groupings or factions, or clusters of potential power, or potential even just narrative power, because that seems to be how we get real power. You form a solid narrative, and then wait 10 years, and then you actually see it manifest in the world.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I do see a lot more. I actually think that if there is a sort of if they decide to sort of pull the plug on the really extreme woke imperialism or what have you, I actually think it could come as this kind of thermidor, like within the center left. Like I could see, for example, I mean, look at how when all um the Black Lives Matter riots and stuff were going on, like obvious anyone who said anything critical about them would be instantly like unpersoned. But then the elections happen, Joe Biden wins, and his people say, actually, we don't like that slogan. We don't like this and we don't like that. We want to Antifa need to go home. We don't like abolish the police. So I think like and they totally survived that, right? Like everyone just had to accept, well, they're in power and this is what they say. So I could actually see, I also think an interesting way of, I sometimes watch Bill Maher's show, his like TV show, and I think it's a really good way. It's a good way of measuring kind of the temperature in those circles. These are like, people who are right in the middle of certainly cultural power, but they're very boomerish, like they're kind of boomer liberals in their political views. They don't really like the socialist left at all, and they just basically want some. They want to go back to just being for legalizing weed and being against, religion or something like that. Like that's kind of all they care about. But at the same time, like they are kind of back in power now, those type of liberals, and they did, they got rid of all of their enemies to the right and left, and they actually exercised power in a very shrewd way. And even if you go back and think of like I was thinking recently of Barack Obama mentioning that he was reading Patrick Deneen's How Liberalism Failed, or
Yeah, gave it a good
yeah,
review too.
yeah, and that was years ago. So there's a funny way in which like the ideological kind of malleability or something of that type of liberal centrist politics sometimes can make it actually much more strong and much more able to survive change. And it also means that they can change their minds on something and they'll never even explain why. Like something that they decided was evil and wrong, last year, they can change their mind on that and just survive it. And everyone just has to kind of accept that these are the people in power and they've decided
Yeah.
this now. So
Kids
I
in
could see, for
Cages
example,
was
yes,
a good
exactly,
example.
exactly. Yes, exactly. I mean, that's a perfect example. But also, I could see them. I don't think that it's a good look for America to be this insane looking when there is now a shift in power with the rise of China. Like, I wouldn't want to. I mean, I don't think China is just about to overtake the US, right? I think the US has more power. It's got more power than that. I mean, the fact that they have military bases all over the world, they have like a lot of financial power and stuff like that. Um, but I could see I could see a kind of strange like right wing turn within the liberal center in a strange way, and it wouldn't be because they don't care about ideology. They would just be making a tactical decision that we want America to rule the world. We want America to keep its dominance as the sole superpower of the world. And this crazy ideology, which we came up with in part as a kind of soft power, is no longer working in our benefit. and they could actually pull the plug on it. That could happen. I could actually see that. I see little signs of it now, but it's too kind of soon to tell if those are just individuals. Yeah.
The eternal battle between, hanging on to power and, drinking your own Kool-Aid, which is gonna be, I don't know, the idea that, America doesn't really deserve to be, hegemonic in a way. It is, but it shouldn't be, because that's, colonial. Yeah, it seems that this thinking's been really, I don't know, it's seeps through quite a lot, at least in the elite circles. I don't think there's a coherent defense of why the US should be a global power in America now.
No, no. I mean, and especially because in the past, the hangover from the Cold War was always that freedom, right? Like this is a uniquely free place. You have freedom of speech and gun rights and all kinds of things like that. But of course, nobody really believes in that now, because in order to get, the kind of the rightful, like people steering the imperial ship or whatever back into power, and to get all these crazy people that Trump brought in to politics out, they had to actually destroy they had to destroy a lot of the kind of mystique around their own power, so like they had to just exercise brute power. They had to send the FBI in to break into people's homes and arrest people. They had to get rid of free speech, and even the pretense of it. So all that stuff is gone now, which is not a small thing. I mean, as I say, it's not, I don't think it's how power really works ultimately anyway, but it was the thing that made, I guess, America able to justify its right to rule the world, you know?
Yeah. And speaking of overreach, I mean, this has been quite the year. Last year, especially this year as well. Um, some quite major overreach all around the world in terms of how power acts. And obviously, I'm speaking about COVID and lockdowns and the new normal, and 2 weeks to save the NHS or whatever, stop the spread, flatten the curve.
Yeah.
And now we're in this, and it seems like the new normal doesn't really refer to the virus. It refers to the level of government overreach we are willing to put up with.
Mm.
And it seems like we are willing to put up with it, because now, for example, here in my hometown, we have completely delegated the nature, the structure of our life to an algorithm. So everything is pegged to case incidents, not fatalities, which I think would be a more robust measure, but still nuts, still completely crazy. But to case incidents. So if there's more than 4 cases, you get a, I don't know, 8 p.m. curfew. You need to wear the mask. You need to shut down the restaurants. So businesses open and close depending on what statistics show up the week before, and that's
Mm.
it. No people involved. That is the mechanism of power now, and everyone's just like, oh, case incidence is above 4. It's below 7. It's fine. And the level of just absolute neutrality that people have already learned to accept this type of stuff as a new normal is completely terrifying to me.
Mm. Yeah, I know you always hear there's a certain type of like a libertarian minded person who lives in the countryside and owns guns and things like that, um, who says, like, oh, if the government ever did this, I'd stand up for myself and I wouldn't take that, I'd go out fighting. And actually, now we know, like, if the government actually does make you do really really crazy stuff, like, you probably will just go along with it, actually. And it's so interesting because I'm not like an I haven't resisted this in a huge way. My attitude is sort of like, these are the people in power. They have already made these decisions. Just go along with it for a while. And I know it's like famous last words before you lose all your rights. But that was kind of my attitude, honestly. Like, I'm used to, just like having I guess I sort of just accepted that, well, look, if it is going to cause these deaths, then maybe this is just something we have to do for a certain period of time, and then things will reopen, and maybe they will. Like I don't know. I know there are some people saying like we've given up these fundamental rights and now we'll never get them back and so on. They could be proven right. I really don't know, but yeah, I definitely did show. I guess it showed kind of almost like we got the first bit of this with the smoking ban. I remember when the smoking ban came into Ireland, everyone said, "Oh, this is never going to work," because again, all those country people who live in the country, they have their own laws out there. You know, the old man who goes to the little bar in the small town, he's not going to put out his cigarette. And actually, everyone did. Everyone did exactly what they were told instantly at 1 minute past midnight on whatever the day it was. Um, and uh, and what? So what is the? It's sort of like I think the only two really interesting things that were said about the whole COVID thing were immediately after we all realized it was happening. There was that like little over and back between like Agamben and Zizek, right? Zizek was sort of essentially saying, this is like our self-sacrifice, our collective self-sacrifice, and we're going to relearn like what it means to make a sacrifice for the collective good. And Agamben was saying, actually, we have made this kind of like technocratic vision so important that we will give up everything that matters in life. So I
Yeah.
mean it's a hard one to argue, right? Because like, so if they said from now on everyone has to be 3 feet apart in all circumstances except really special ones, and if we don't do that, this many people will die. Well, then you have to make the argument of why that many people, why being able to be just a few inches away from somebody is so important that this number of people, it's worth this number of people dying. Like it's sort of a moral
The thing
argument to
is,
make it.
we make these, we make these implicitly, these moral calculuses, calculi, every day. Driving is terrible.
Yeah.
Keeping alcohol legal, even worse. All of these things, they exist and they're embedded. They're just not discussed. Death stalks the land, whatever you do. And to me, I probably side with Agamben here because the denial of death that's been rampant
Mm.
in this idea, and the way it kind of escalated from the beginning. It was okay, stop the spread, let's see if we can prepare the hospitals for the inevitable influx of people. And that was the framing. Okay, we need to prepare to help these people when they get sick. To
Mm.
Oh, we have cases. Oh, there's been one case in Victoria, Australia, so we're shutting down the country.
Mm.
This is a huge escalation, and it happened, very slippery slope style, slippity slip. We're in this in this situation, and it's this level I'm definitely not comfortable with, because
Yeah.
you're not going to be able to exercise the Grim Reaper if you, I don't know.
Yes.
That's just not going to happen. And it's
Yeah, but that is kind of almost like it has in an interesting way kind of like unmasked. Like you sometimes think, what, okay, so we got rid of all of these ancient institutions, we got rid of that gave meaning to the sort of ordered society in some way and gave meaning to our lives. And what did we replace it with? And people typically say consumerism, liberalism, so on. But I actually think it might be this, just like, because the idea is like the reason all those institutions existed, like religion or whatever, were that they served this. Well, one of the reasons is that they did serve this kind of social function of regulating, like encouraging positive behaviors and discouraging socially negative behaviors and things like that. And I think like the vision that the kind of post-war technocratic vision is one where we don't have to have our individual desires oppressed by these institutions any longer, and we will do what they used to do better, but through purely rational technocratic means. So we will find everything that is wrong with society, and we will fix it through expertise. We'll employ, millions of sociologists if need be, all over the place, and we will fix every single human problem there is, so that we'll never have the need for these superstitious and other institutions um, that oppress our like individual freedoms and desires and so forth. Like, and that is a kind of utopian vision, isn't it? Like, I mean, it sounds horrible the way I'm saying it, but
Yeah, it's a
it
transhumanist ideal. It's
yes,
quite common. It's the idea that, the constraints of not only your social life, but the constraints of your body can be left behind. You can transcend to a greater plane if you just use enough technology.
yeah. And I'm sure many of the people who designed this idea, probably thought, yeah, it would be a good thing if people didn't die of horrible plagues and things like that. I can see why they thought that this would be utopian, but I guess there's no brakes on it, so it gets to a point where it becomes you would have to just live in a bubble, or you would have to have a totally you'd have to destroy everything that is of value just to kind of get the chart looking the way you want it to.
Yeah, and there's some. I mean, now I'm gonna get really esoteric, but there's some logic to how nature works. Death as well. Some might argue even infant mortality, the way it used to be, that is grim. It's terrible. It's something you don't really want to be confronted with. But if you change these patterns at scale, things might crash further down the line. Like, just imagine, now we have an inverse pyramid of people that we will need to be taking care of. Obviously, we don't want any of them to die. I would love them to live infinitely, but there are second order, third order consequences of us, engaging in the denial of death too much,
Hmm.
and maybe keeping people alive for 120 years, because we can do that, but maybe we can't do that with them being healthy. We can only do that with them being quite sick, and there's all sorts of implications here. And I know that the kind of libertarian transhumanist response to this would be, we just need more tech. We need to make them healthier at 120, and we need to keep them being productive or something. I'm sure there's some tech utopian idea that you can slap onto there and say, actually, this is not a problem. It's just a problem, or it's a problem in need of a solution. But I feel like we're never going to catch this train. And there's so
Yeah.
many second order effects to these things that one great idea at the beginning turns into the whole train derailment down the line.
Mm. You gave the example earlier of the car, like the fact that if we were to actually see these ideas through to their logical conclusion, we would never drive cars again, right? Because cars kill people. And so the value of being able to drive a car would be completely lost, because you would sound like a
Maniac.
psychopath if you said, well, listen, some people are going to have to die, but I like the convenience of being able to drive to work. You know, one thing that has really taken hold in the last like decade, maybe a shorter amount of time than that, is that um, actually we're constantly drawing upon moral arguments and presuppositions that really we haven't ever had to spell out, because they're so common sense, right? So you don't really have to explain to somebody that what I just said, right, about cars, that there are road deaths, but making everyone in the world walk from now on would not be worth those road deaths. The problem is that, you know, I think one of the reasons that let's just call it the cultural left has been very good at is exploiting those kind of common sense things that we're used to not having to explain. And when they really push hard on them, you realize that people actually aren't very good at explaining them and are often, kind of morally like ashamed to explain them because they don't sound very good, because but they actually do make sense in a sort of common sense world. So for example, if they were to take up, let's say like everything goes back to normal after COVID gets under control, and they were to take up driving, and they said, look at all these people who die every year, and also that you can put gas in this disgusting thing and go to where you want to go just for convenience. So you think that this many people dying is worth your convenience? Like, if they really, really, really push that, I know it sounds crazy, but I'm actually using a deliberately crazy example because it's exactly the kind of thing that could happen. If they decided to make this a crusade and shouted down every public figure and forced every public figure to say on the record that they think it's okay that this many people die every year, everyone would just bend to their will. And so, wouldn't they? Like, it's very easy to see that. And so why is that? Like, why? Is it just that they discovered some tactic that nobody knew before, or is it that we have this kind of
I think,
style of, yeah.
yeah, I think the moral high ground is very thin for a regime that, essentially kind of prides itself on being morally neutral, on being, pluralistic, and on having to be pluralistic to accommodate all the different visions that exist in our society. So there's essentially it's open season for who wants to take the moral high ground, and if a sufficiently intransigent minority of people want to take on that mantle and want to be sufficiently loud and can make a case. I mean, with car deaths, you can definitely make a case. And, like Extinction Rebellion essentially made that case, so it didn't work out exactly the way they wanted to, but it was a very similar case. It was like, oh, you want to be traveling around in your car because, people are dying of climate related deaths and, in the third world or things like that. So they did make kind of that moral equivalency, and it worked to a certain point, but they're probably still at the base of the mountain with that one. But it's a great strategy if you have a morally neutral regime, which
Mm.
is what it has to be. Then yeah, sure, go crazy. Anyone can take the crown.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, I mean, you just have to be you just have to be loud enough and crazy enough, and
yeah.
present a convincing narrative. Bring some anecdotes. Starving this, dying that. Pictures, video works really well.
Well,
Um,
you have to be sort of like Luther. You have to be doing a more extreme version of what already exists. So all you're really doing is you're pushing those in power on the things that they already claim to stand for. So even, for example, there's been lots of really interesting things written about the kind of cultural revolution of recent years. Like, what is it? Like, where did it come from? What are its origins, and so on, its ideological origins and stuff. And the typical, and some would say like it's an institutional thing. It comes from academia or maybe the NGOs and so on. Um, but I think that really, if there is a coherent ideology there, and like I said before, I don't think ideologies are ultimately that important anymore. But if there is, the ethos or whatever it is that is driving them, it's really kind of just a very literalist or very absolutist kind of Americanism. Like the ideology that fuels the radical cultural American left has absolutely nothing in common with any with historical socialism. I think it's not. It doesn't. It has like the thing that really drives it, the thing that makes them completely like red in the face with like emotions and screaming at people and like just being completely overwhelmed with emotion and having to really like enforce a moral principle. What they're usually doing is they're taking a thing that is already a sacrosanct part of post-war Americanism, and they're just pushing it that a little step further. you know. So like so like equality of outcome, right? um, Total gender, racial, every other type of equality of outcome is one of the things that is like central to this whole cultural revolution that they're trying to engineer. So conservatives then come along and say, oh, well, Martin Luther King said, blah, 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 content of your character. But it's such a silly argument, because do they really think that if he had lived and he had seen that, this kind of like technical meritocracy didn't produce the outcomes that he wanted, that he would have said, okay, that's fine, as long as in some really technical definition this is egalitarian, that's fine, that's all I wanted. Like, that's not like how people work. It doesn't make any sense. So all that the woke people are doing is taking what the official ideology of post-war America is anyway, and they're just basically holding their own elites like feet to the fire. They're making them go the whole way,
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah, it's a logical conclusion of it. I keep hearing that it's some form of aberration of what America's supposed to stand for.
No.
This is just take 5 steps ahead, and you'll meet the wokesters at the bar. That's it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
there's there's not really any other direction to go in, because like you said, this whole the contrast between equality of outcome and equality of opportunity. How many iterations do you want to let this play out and get unequal results? Which obviously, if you're a reasonable person, you will understand that there's going to be different reasons for different unequal results. You will have unequal results. For this is what happens. It's happened everywhere in the world historically. This is it. But if you want to live the ethos of American liberalism, then this is the normal conclusion. You
Mm.
want to have the equality. You want to live equality rather than just espouse it. So yeah, that definitely. Cool. Well, before I let you go, because I know we're pretty much at the end of our time, I want to ask you the question of the show, which is, do you have a thinker or writer, or could be, to be honest, anyone living or dead, that you think people should know more of or read more of?
I wish I had someone who is obscure enough to warrant me recommending them. I'm sure everyone who listens to this already knows I'm going to say Christopher Lash, but he's having a bit of a revival lately, which is good. But yeah, I think so. And also, he's not the books that are best known, I suppose, are Revolt of the Elites and Culture of Narcissism, which are both great. But he wrote a very big book about progress, which is like one of the biggest, to me. It's one of the biggest questions you can take on, really. And he's also written some great stuff about women and feminism and the role of women, very nuanced, like and yeah. And I also think it's funny too, because sometimes I see like people who like Lash, maybe some of the more conservative people who like Lash, but they're sort of a little bit queasy about his use of Freud, and a lot of psychoanalysis. I actually came across something recently that he wrote a New Left Review about psychoanalysis, and it's like, in that brilliant way, he starts off with this really interesting point that it's so strange that these kind of Marxists absorbed psychoanalysis when, like, psychoanalysis is conservative in some fundamental way because it recognizes the limitations of human beings. Um, so he's always really interesting at finding those kind of contradictions and kind of builds the piece on that. But and yeah, but I also think that the it's a very slim book, but like Freud's Civilization and Its Discontents is probably the book that has stayed with me and has remained in my thoughts more than anything else, which is weird because when I initially read it, I couldn't have known that, but having gone through having like spent years considering many different ways of explaining things, I think that that tension between the needs of civilization, which are by definition hostile to the individual will, and for the collective will, that kind of push and pull like will always be going on in human societies, you know. And that even helps you to see kind of what the modern left is in a way, right? Because um, they have this total contradiction of values between, on the one hand, economic collectivism, which involves, you know, people pooling their resources together, people working together, people giving up kind of the individual desires to the collective good. So they might say, for example, there shouldn't be any billionaires. No matter how much that billionaire wants to be a billionaire, they should be forced to give to the collective good. But then they also have this social and cultural philosophy, which is that no way, nothing should get in the way of my individual will, including the collective good, you know. And so I guess before even socialism in its early forms, like when it first emerged, you know, before that, like I do think that religion was very much the precursor to it, in the sense that like it served this social function of, as I said, like making pro-social behaviors moral goods, and to be admired and to be strived for, and making selfish or antisocial behaviors the opposite, taboo. And but yeah, the modern left, the kind of post-war like Western left has come up with this crazy thing that just can't work, which is the pursuit. They want to have the total pursuit of individual desires with no imposition from the community or the collective good or anything like that. So they have to sweep away all the institutions that used to do that. It used to do that through means other than the government. And then they try to correct that by sort of like social democracy, really, like just like a kind of a mothering social democratic economics. And yeah, I think it's impossible. It's not, that's why it hasn't worked anywhere, you know, that combination of things. Like, I think that you can have a more socialist economic system with a lot of things that they don't want, you know, that are going to there are going to be values of social conformity that are going to have to come along with that, as well as things like sovereign nation states with borders that they are allowed to control. They obviously can't accept any of those things. So, you know, it's built to not work, you know, really. And in fact, Christopher Lasch wrote an essay many years ago, it was like 30 years ago or something, called Conservatism Against Itself. And he was sort of making this argument, which I think now has been accepted among smart people on the right, but it was more novel at the time, which was sort of the reverse, where he was saying you cannot have economic individualism and cultural collectivism.
Yeah, exactly. The libertarian economics will nuke any substructure that they're
Yeah,
applied to.
yeah.
Yeah, it seems very obvious, but this is my constant flame war with the libertarians.
Yeah, I can't believe they're still going.
Oh, they are. They comment almost on every post I make. Yeah, just this morning. Yeah, well,
Do they ever make good arguments? Like, do they ever say anything that convinces you or makes you
I
doubt?
mean, I used to be a libertarian. Believe me, I have
Mm,
consumed the Rothbard, and I know the arguments. They work very well in 2D. Add
mm,
dimension to the picture, it doesn't really work. I mean, they're mathematically perfect.
mm,
But apply the human animal to them, it all collapses. And add game theory and, you know, like incentives and philosophical concepts like what is the individual, you know, like how
mm,
do people make decisions, you know, mimetic theory. Mimetic theory
mm,
nukes libertarianism in one fell swoop. You know, there's many
mm,
ways to attack this beast, this mathematical, you know, construct. Works great on paper, but doesn't work well in reality. And also, no one will ever vote for it. You know, pure
mm,
libertarianism has no constituency for a good reason because it's
mm.
bogus. So yeah, sorry libertarians. I know some of my audience is libertarian. Not for long, guys. Keep listening. Are you working on anything now? Is there a book upcoming, some projects, something you
I'm
might?
working I'm working on a couple of things, but I have to keep them a secret. So
Okay.
when does this come out?
I think this will come out a bit earlier on Patreon, so I think that's probably in the next 2 weeks. It'll be on Patreon, and then maybe in a month and a little bit on YouTube and on all podcast platforms. So I just do early releases on Patreon.
Okay. Well, probably by the time this comes out, I will have a new thing out, but I can't say what it is.
It's all good. When you have the new thing, just let me know. I shall
Yeah. Oh, yeah, that
publicize
would be
it.
great. Thank you.
Sure. My pleasure. Yeah, this has been really fun. I'm really happy we got to do this. Yeah, you're definitely one of the top people I wanted to chat to on this podcast. You know, mission
Oh, thanks so
accomplished.
much. Yeah, that's great. And I'm really enjoying your Substack.
Oh, thank you, thank you. I need to put more stuff on it. I've been so preoccupied with the podcast, but yeah, I shall. I'll do better. Yeah, and I mean, where can people find you? Can people find you? Should people find you? I don't know anything.
No, no, they
No.
shouldn't.
People should not find Angela. Don't search for her. Leave her alone, guys. She's had
Yeah,
enough.
I'm currently I'm starting to learn to play the harp, which is very nice. And so anytime I think about social media, I just go and play the harp instead.
Yeah, that's just probably the wisest thing you'll ever hear on this podcast. And what was it? Yeah, Kill All Normies. Please buy the book. It's really good. It gives you an amazing overview on what this internet thing was about. Maybe I guess up to maybe about 4 years ago. It's
Yeah,
quite
yeah,
comprehensive. Yeah, new stuff. Maybe in the new project we'll see.
yeah. I think American Affairs and Unheard are probably the places you're most likely to find my stuff going forward.
Cool. Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Angela.
Okay, thank you.